hadith that he collected primarily were five, space of 5 people between him and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. For example, the chapter we're looking at today is Babu Kayfa Kana Kalam Rasulillahi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In a chapter regarding how did the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam speak. And this is on the context of hadith. The first one is Haddathana Humayd. So he says, on the message of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I heard this hadith from Humayd. Number one, an Usama bin Zayd. Sorry, Haddathana Humayd bin Mas'ada al-Basri. So Humayd bin Mas'ada. Haddathana Humayd bin Aswad. That's number two. And Usama bin Zayd. Number three. And Zuhri, number four. And Urwa and Aisha, number 5 and 6. So from Urwa, from Aisha. So 6 people. Imam Tirmidhi mentions hadith from 6 people between him and the chain, between him and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so once he actually gathered this collection of hadith, in around 200 years after the hijrah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it's been a manner of teaching that the teacher would teach this book or his collection of hadith from the chain from his teacher until today. So you actually have a lot of scholars until today who actually have a direct chain between them and the Prophet, I mean, primarily between them and Imam Tirmidhi, who has this collection of hadith, where each hadith he basically collected from his teacher, and that teacher from his teacher to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And again, so it's done till now. So again, I myself, when I learned this, when I went through this book in South Africa, direct chain between myself, the sanad between myself and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I'm pretty sure Sheikh had it as well. So I mean, when you kind of look at this book, I know today it's an ad hoc chapter that we're going through, but a lot of times this book is taught in a sitting over a series, maybe a weekend or a month or a year, where you would, in a sense, learn the collection of a hadith directly to you yourself and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So I think something to think about, inshallah. Again, if this series is continued, if Sheikh Hassan is doing it, or next year if it happens again, from beginning to end, if you attend every single hadith, every single lecture, you will have a direct chain between you and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, what is the purpose of it? So Imam point was that if you look at your life, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam had come down. Sorry, the Prophet Muhammad was a prophet directly to kind of explain the way to be a Muslim. Right? He is from the humans, not an angel. Who was not sent out as an angel. He was rather a human who was born a human, taught through Jibreel alayhi salam and through his own qualities how to be the perfect human. And Aisha radiallahu anha, she was asked, like, tell me about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. She mentioned very clearly that the Prophet was the Quran. He was a living, interact being at all times, this exemplifying what the Quran meant to be and how to be. So in this chapter, the reason I think it's important is our communication with one another is the ultimate, it's the way we engage. And how the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam engaged, it's a very good medium to kind of learn how we can be with one another. It comes in the hadith as well. Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, one day he was holding on to his tongue. And when Umar radiallahu anhu came to him and said, "Yeah, Abu Bakr, what are you doing holding on to your tongue?" Abu Bakr mentioned that, is there anything that throws a person into hellfire more than the way that they interact, the way they speak? So I'm just holding on to my tongue here, exercising, reminding myself, how do I speak, what do I say, and just trying to minimize my speech, because this is ultimately what will bring me closer to Allah or to the hell. So again, speech and interactions are very important. And in this chapter 34, I'm skipping some chapters because I'm not sure where Sheikh Sam was. But again, it's chapter number 34, and Imam Tirmidhi, he's collected the hadith. There's a few simple ones. If you want to be a good communicator, like the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how do you speak, and what do you say, and what is important to understand? So again, first he has 3 hadith in this chapter, and the first one is, he says, حدثنا حميد بن مسعد البصري رضي الله عنه رحمة الله عليه حدثنا حميد الأسود عن أسامة بن زيد عن الزهري عن عروة عن عائشة رضي الله تعالى عنها قالت ما كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يسرد كسردكم هذا ولكنه كان يتكلم بكلام بين فصل يحفظه من جلس إليه. First hadith he mentions, he says that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So again, the word here he is yasrudu كَسَرْدِكُمْ هَذَا. The samdan in Arabic means cold. So again, it's used in three different ways. If the temperature is cold, you would use sub. Emotionally, sorry, that's number one, the weather. Number two, if example you're drinking tea, and you have a hot cup of tea and you keep it for a long time, and after a long time has passed, the tea became cold. You would say that the tea has become cold. You would use something as well for that. And number three is your emotion. Emotionally, if a person is very like cold in their emotion, you would use something. This person's not very like there's no warmth in their tone of the way you're speaking to me. You would just say, so here this is the context that comes over here. That whenever the قال ما كان رسول الله صلى الله ما كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يسجد كسجدكم هذا. Like when you talk to one another in a cold way, like mocking somebody, being rude to someone, or being harsh, or even speaking fast, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would not speak. Meaning the Prophet would be very warm in his tone when he would speak to one. ولكنه كان يتكلم بكلام بين فصل. And number two, also when he spoke, his words were very clear. بين فصل. So he would also space out his words and speak in a clear manner. يحفظه من جلس إليه. Whoever was sitting around him, whoever was listening to him, they would remember what he had said. So meaning the first hadith that Imam Tirmidhi mentioned is that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was a very gentle communicator, clear, speaking slowly, and also his words would remain. And again, if you look at the context of that, meaning so you want to look at the hadith regarding this. For example, we look at the hadith of Anas bin Malik radiallahu anhu. Anas bin Malik mentioned that I spent a lot of time with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Does anyone know the wrong age of Anas bin Malik when he was with the Prophet? Again, the starting age.
14.
14, yes.
7.
7, yes. 9. Yeah, so it comes here. He says, I grew up around the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And again, the exact age is not captured. I mean, the scholars have spoken about it, but it comes. They say that when he initially spent time in the khidmah, in the working with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was between the age of 7 and 10. Like he went in as a child. And if you look at where this number come from, because again, from the hadith, the Prophet said that that teacher told him to pray when they're 7. So and was and discipline them under. So meaning he says I was a mature child when I was around the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam between the age of 7 and 10. That is when I spent time with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He says I used to see that the Prophet, whenever a child would come to him and be like, Ya Rasulullah, I want to show you something, or can I tell you something? He would generally, unless he was very busy, he would put his full attention to that child. And that's Anas bin Malik mentioning it, who himself was a child. So again, first thing is, the Prophet was very calm, collected, gentle in his way of communicating. And that gentleness, again, he was not cold and harsh and aggressive like you guys, meaning this in general. He was very calm, collected, and attentive. That is what that means. And again, to the extent that Anas bin Malik says, if a child came and wanted to speak to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they were given that. Number two, Amr bin As mentions that he says that I used to communicate with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the way he would give me attention, I honestly thought I was the most beloved to him. This is, I think, mentioned before as well. And then he's mentioning this himself. He says, the Prophet was so gentle, attentive towards me, and caring about me when I spoke to him. I thought I was his best friend. Meaning every single person that came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they got the attention like they were the best friend of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to the extent that they thought this. So again, Anas bin Malik mentioned, he says, one day I was a young man in his 20s, and I went to the Prophet to show off. And I went to him in front of others and said, Ya Rasulullah, who is your best friend? And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam mentioned and responded that Aisha radiallahu anha, she is my best friend. Yeah, I mean from the men, not from the woman. Who is your best friend from the men? And then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, Abuha, her father is my best friend. Thumma ya Rasulullah. And then the Prophet, and then say, Ya Rasulullah, who is next? Mention another. And then mention another companion. It says, Fa'adda rijal. It says the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam went through the name of many people when asked, and he said, I became silent, realizing that if I keep on asking in front of others, I may be the very last person on it. So the reality is, again, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam treated everyone with respect, with care, with love, and he was present in a warm tone with everybody. So again, the conclusion of first hadith is very clearly that in our interactions with one another, whether we're interacting with a Muslim, whether we're interacting with a non-Muslim, and again, this extends to our social media communication as well. Many times we become upset, we become angry for right reasons. Somebody may be talking about Islam, maybe talking about your friend, talking about organization. When we're responding, yes, the Prophet stood for justice, he stood for help, but he never engaged aggressively with others. And then the Quran mentions as well, وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا. When an ignorant person engages with you, what did Allah say? قَالُوا سَلَامًا. Say to them peace. Does not literally mean you say peace to them, but in your meaning respond to them with peace. Like, you know what, this conversation is not important. I don't want to talk. Whatever way, on social media, on a chain of, on comments, how do you respond? You can respond aggressively, or you can respond positively, or you can disengage positively as well. So again, looking at communication with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we want to look at how we engage. We want to engage with him. The next hadith that he mentioned, he says, حدثنا محمد بن يحيى حدثنا أبو قتيبة عن عبد الله بن المثنى عن ثمامة عن أنس بن مالك. So again, this hadith, again, 5 people between Imam Tirmidhi rahmatullah alayhi and the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And the hadith is, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يعيد الكلمة ثلاثا لتعقل عنه. This is more when he was teaching the companions or when he spoke about something important. They said the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam would repeat a word 3 times so it can be understood. Communication, especially as a teacher, especially as an educator, especially in giving instructions, the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam would mention something 3 times. The third hadith and the last hadith regarding this is عن سفيان بن وكيع حدثنا جميع بن عمر بن عبد الرحمن حدثني رجل من بني تميم يكنى أبا عبد الله عن أبي لأبي حالة عن حسن بن علي. So again, 5 people between Imam Tirmidhi and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So hadith is Hasan bin Ali radiallahu anhu, the grandson of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He mentioned قال سألت خالي. So Hasan bin Ali, the grandson of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, says that I asked my aunt Hind bin Abi Hala wa kana wasafan. So I asked Hind radiallahu anha, and she was a wasaf. A wasaf was somebody who would be you have friends who are comedians, right? You have friends who are, they joke around a lot. You have friends who are really smart regarding certain elements. So a wasaf, again, now we have there's social media, photography, media. At the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there were people who were, in a sense, they would describe others. This is how this person was, in a sense, they would educate you. So she was a wasaf, meaning she knew the characteristics, the traits and even leadership. So she was a wasaf. And he said, I asked her, can you explain to me how did the Prophet communicate? قال. And she told me, and then now Abu Hasan bin Ali is mentioning, كان رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. How was the communication, the conversation? If you were to sit, so again, he's asking her, if I were to sit with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and I spoke to him, how would you describe him as a communicator in general? So she says that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was mutawasil al-ahzan. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if you sat around him and observed his communication, he was mutawasil al-ahzan. He was a person who was always in state of worry. So again, very different. He was not a depressed person. The Prophet was not depressed in any way. But he was always in a state of worry, meaning, when you're speaking to somebody and they have like an exam later that day or they have something going on, you can tell they're not anxious, but they're occupied in the state out of worry. So she says the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam at all times he was in a state of worry, meaning he was worried about him. He was always in a caring, worrisome state. That al fikra, and then that always in deep thought. So occupied. So what is when you go to the listeners, there's active listening, there's passive listening. You're talking to somebody, they're not really engaged with. So the Prophet was always actively engaged. But again, he was he was always occupied, busy with something. He was in a state of deep thought. لَيْسَتْ لَهُ رَاحَةٌ. He had no rest. So meaning again, it's the same thing. He was occupied but engaged. He was in deep thought, and he was no peace. Meaning he was always thinking about the next thing to do or how to help somebody or what he's doing himself. The wheel is suffering. The Prophet ﷺ was more of a person who would spend more time in silence. Meaning he would engage with us, but he was not someone who was always talking. And then she describes it. She says, لا يتكلم في غير حاجة, that the Prophet ﷺ would not speak without need. يفتتح الكلام ويختمه بسم الله تعالى. Whenever the Prophet ﷺ would start speaking, or any speech, he would do it with the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is what ihsan is, right? When we look at so as a Muslim, we have two states. Our inner state is Islam, our inner state is Iman, and our outer state is Islam. Does anyone find the difference between Islam and Iman is? I can't, the inner state and outer state. What's define the difference between Islam and Iman? Anyone?
Iman is more so the conviction and the belief, or Islam is carrying out the actions and submitting towards the actions that are prescribed to us.
Yeah, so that's very accurate. Islam is our outer state of belief. Meaning, how do we manifest our Islam? Our belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how we manifest it. And again, that is categorized through the Hadith, which is the 5 pillars, meaning that our salah, our belief in Allah, our fasting, our zakat, our going for Hajj, and also our interactions with one another externally. And Iman is our inner state of belief regarding between us and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? How do we actually how we internalize what we're doing externally? Whether it's prayer. Because prayer has there's an element of Islam to it, there's the element of Iman. So Islam is, whether you're in class or if you're busy after class is done, or starting your day, ending your day, ultimately as a Muslim, I submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with my prayer. And Iman is why am I submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because I believe Allah is a creator, Allah controls everything, and this is my responsibility to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So again, that's the state of it. And ihsan is the perfection between the external and internal. And that is that you live your life externally submitting to Allah and internally internalizing your life with your purpose of your life, with your actions, your interactions with one another, in the state that you know that Allah is watching you. And that you are looking at Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning, if Allah is in front of me at this moment, how would I behave? That is the ultimate level. And if you cannot come to that state that Allah is watching. In a constant state of understanding that Allah is there with me. And again, looking back at this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he was a person who was generally silent. كلامه فصل, and his words were very clear. ولا فضول ولا تقصير. He would not talk too much, nor would he be very like this. Like, when somebody talks to you and gives you one-word answers, hey, how's your day today? Like, hey, what's your opinion about this? No. Like, that's very short speech. So the Prophet was engaged, meaning he would not speak too much, but when you asked him something, he would give you an accurate response, or he would engage you. So again, here, كلامه فصل, his words were very clear. لا فضول ولا تقصير. He would not speak too much or not less. ليس بالجافي ولا المهين. He was neither jafi wala al-maheen, so he was not demeaning. Maheen is like demeaning, aggressive demeaning, and he was not, of course, he was not rough in his speech. يعظم النعمة وإن ضاقت, and he would always, he would emphasize the blessings. How are you? Alhamdulillah, that understanding that context. He would always, whatever blessing that he had, or whatever the conversation was, he would look at the positives of that conversation. So يعظم النعمة وإن ضاقت, even if someone's talking aggressively or harshly towards him or talking about a negative subject, he would focus on a positive. So you take glasses half. When you look at a glass that has filled with water to the half point, are you looking at half full or half? So again, positive of every element, the Prophet would look at everything as a glass of half full, right? يعظم النعمة وإن ضاقت. He would look at the blessings even if they're little, and then the scholar, the narrator, which was Hind bin Abi Halaf, she mentions لا يضم منها شيئا غير أنه لم يكن يضم ذواقا ولا ينتقل. He would not talk negatively about food. To the extent that, when you look at food as well, he would not, if the food was not good, he would not talk bad about it. And if it was great, he would not go on too much about it. Meaning he would talk positively, but not overemphasize it. And then the last part of the hadith is وَإِذَا غَضِبَ أَعْرَضَ وَأَشَارَ. When he was angry, he would turn away. So whenever the Prophet ﷺ was upset about anything, he would not engage, he would disengage, he would turn away. وَإِذَا فَرِحَ غَضَّ طَرْفَهُ. And when he was happy, when he was delighted about something, when he was happy about something, he would not overly just, start laughing and screaming and joking around. He would kind of just smile and he would look. And then they describe that. جُلُّ ضَحِكِهِ التَّبَسُّمُ. That his laughter was mostly smiles. So his happiness was mostly through smiling. يَفْتَرُ أَنْ مِثْلِ حَبِّ الْغَمَامِ. And then the last description is again, so Habil Ghamam is like hailstone. You know what, like, and again, here it's like snow. You know when hail comes down, ice comes down from the sky. We know what hail is. So Yaftaru and Mithli Habil Ghamam. And he would laugh. So again, hadith again, it's Julu Dahati at Tabassumu. His happiness and laughter would be smiling. And then his happiness, when it would kind of manifest, it would come out with big like smiles. So his teeth would show like white stone. So this is the conclusion of the three hadith that Imam Tirmidhi mentioned regarding the way the Prophet ﷺ communicated. Again, I want to summarize. The main point was when he started it is when the Prophet was not cold and harsh in his communication. And we want to look at our communication to one another, whether it's our, again, it's different parts of our lives. When we're going through teenage years, we become getting more aggressive with others that we communicate. When we get a little bit older and then we feel we have experience in life, we start to become very dismissive. And if you look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ, at all stages of his life, the Prophet was very warm, collected in. So again, the first lesson we take over from today's lesson would be, when you want to be a communicator like the Prophet ﷺ, let's be very mindful of what we say and how we say it and the context we're speaking. That was number one. Number two, the Prophet ﷺ, again, giving instructions. So whenever we're giving instructions to another person, again, because a lot of lives, whether we're a parent, whether we're an employer, whether we're a team lead, whether we're presenting something, he would always repeat what he taught. And he would not expect a person to understand something with the first time saying it. So repeating what we're teaching. And the last thing, again, Al-Muhammadiyya bin Ali radiallahu anhu was that the Prophet in summary, he was more silent. He was always mindful, engaged with what he was thinking about. And when the Prophet was angry, he would turn away. And when he was happy, he would look down. He was gentle with this. My dear respected brothers and sisters, again, this is 415 hadith that mentioned how did the Prophet speak, how did the Prophet engage with one another. And inshallah, the goal is throughout the semester to try to get through some of these hadith. Again, inshallah, hopefully next year, more organized, we'll have the full 415 hadith taught over here. And again, with the intention that you go through this, it's like you have a direct chain between you yourself and the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Is as if you were being with the Prophet ﷺ. And again, this is not a hadith, but many scholars, they mention that a lot of people who went through these 415 hadith and implemented in their lives, they saw the Prophet ﷺ in their dreams. So again, I have not. Inshallah, I hopefully do see him. But again, we know that the Prophet ﷺ seeing in the dream is true. And the purpose of it is, again, my sons are now into sports, into soccer. Yeah? My oldest son is 10 years old. He wants this jersey, he wants these shoes, he wants to watch this game, he doesn't want to miss this game that's going on. And it's because, again, it's an infatuation that we have with the sport. And we all have something in life that we engage with. And the purpose of this hadith, again, every single hadith that we read is the teaching and the conversation of the Prophet ﷺ. The definition of a hadith is the words, actions, and approvals of the Prophet ﷺ which are done. So again, the seerah is the life of the Prophet, the hadith are the teachings of the Prophet, or approval of the Prophets. But the difference that this book has is this is basically understanding the Prophet, which you can get through that as well. Again, they're equally important. And again, so the scholars mentioned number one is the seerah. You want to read the seerah of the Prophet. And number two, if you want to go through this, because you will have a deeper appreciation for who the Prophet ﷺ was, how he interacted, and then our goal is to interact. So again, the goal is, inshallah, we go through this book and we learn it, we act upon it, we make Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless us, to accept from us, and inshallah, and also let us follow the footsteps of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.